Hi, I'm Othais, and this is Empty Air, but with advanced CGI efforts, I can perfectly and seamlessly integrate our rifle today. The Mexican Mondragon model of 1894, perhaps the most advanced rifle in the world at the time of its adoption, so long as you count a series of nascent technologies that were ultimately abandoned for more practical solutions. I'll explain all of that and more, including a real example of this rifle, after we get a look at it in the Lightbox. With an overall length of 48 and nearly 1/2 inch and weighing in just shy of 8 pounds, this is actually a fairly familiar set of statistics for an early repeating smokeless rifle. What's interesting though is not only is this a straight pull, but it also uses a double stack end block clip, 6 rounds of 5.2mm Mondragon. Now as you can tell, I do not have our rifle for today's episode here in the studio, but do not worry. We have filmed with several examples in a remote location thanks to the help of a determined author and a consummate collector. Just a reminder though, the only reason we could afford to travel and film these treasures is because of viewers like yourself. Please consider joining us for as low as $1 a month in order to keep the history coming. Additional funding has also come, quite thankfully, from our heroes over at Ballistol, a do-everything oil which we've used for years and only recently managed to secure their help in our ongoing mission. There is literally no other oil that I know of with over 100 years of proven history at never harming and always helping precious collectibles of a ballistic nature. I mean, when you're borrowing something this irreplaceable and valuable, what else would you use without fear? I can't imagine risking my reputation and potentially a lot of liability dollars on anything else. Make sure to buy some of your own and tell them that we sent you. Turning to our topic for today. The Mondragon Rifle was of Mexican origin, with the project really kicking off at the very start of the 1890s. For those of you unfamiliar with Mexican history and politics, this would be about in the middle of the Porfirio Diaz presidency. A controversial figure, Diaz's entry to the presidency had been made on a promise of no re-election, and yet he would soon become a de facto dictator. The reason he managed this support was because his pragmatic approach to politics had, for the first time, settled Mexico into a relatively stable government, and peace was the norm instead of the exception. The prior decades had been marked by foreign rule, revolution, and varied attempts at creating a stable democracy. Diaz also gave strong support to the modernization of Mexico, aligning himself with a group commonly known as the Científicos. These men espoused positivist, science-based politics and finances, which were supposed to bring Mexico into the future. Reform was also brought to the Mexican army, which had proven to be expensive to maintain and riddled with corruption. By 1880, they had shaved off some 10% from the federal forces, and perhaps 3/4 of the various National Guard and governor's militia forces were disbanded. The weapons, both turned in and those left in the field, were a frankly dizzying mix of arms. The most modern was the rolling block, still in the .43 caliber Spanish cartridge. These were made by both Remington and a variant from Whitney Ladley. A contract had also been made for Peabody rifles in the same chambering. The most common carbine was the Spencer, though I'm not sure of the exact model. Most forces, though, were still armed with obsolete muskets. The most numerous were the Enfield and Springfield, but there were plenty of others. In an era where everyone was currently adopting a smokeless powder repeating rifle, it was clear Mexico would need new arms, and plenty of them. Up until this point, corruption, speculation, and kickbacks were the norm, another reason for the dizzying mix of small arms in the Mexican inventory. All of this added expense and complexity to an already pricey refit. Diaz's rule, however, brought both process reform and economic growth. In 1888, he even managed to secure an international loan. These had been cut off by European governments since the death of Maximilian I in 1867. Deposed Emperor of Mexico, a member of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. In this era of growth, technological optimism, and a guiding vision to make Mexico into a first world powerhouse, the obvious direction for small arms would be the development of an advanced small-bore smokeless powder rifle that would be produced domestically along with its ammunition. We know in hindsight that these lofty goals would be somewhat missed, but it's important to keep this perspective in mind as we review the history of our rifle's development today. The first thrust of improvements tended to focus on the rolling block, like this 1884 design for lever action operation, which would speed up reloading. The arm, however, remained single shot, though at the time this wasn't a major factor. In 1888, one Captain Raphael Malin attempted a revolving carbine and began focusing on a sort of caseless ammunition. In 1892, however, he took a radical departure with his recoil-operating semi-automatic rifle. While interesting, this never got much farther than the prototyping phase. Now, while I would love to review every oddball inventor and firearm in Mexico, the title of our episode tells us the man to watch in this era was one Jose Antioco Manuel Maria Mondragon, born in Villa de San Francisco de Ixtlahuaca, October 15, 1859. Young Mondragon was educated at the Scientific and Literary Institute of Toluca. Later on, he and his brother Enrique would travel to Mexico City to attend the National Preparatory High School. In 1876, he was admitted as a cadet into the Chapultepec Military College, graduating as a lieutenant in December of 1881. He was assigned to the 4th Artillery Battalion until 1883, which is when he was promoted to 2nd Captain and transferred to the 3rd Artillery until 1886, at which time he became a captain in service of the National Gunpowder Factory. As an artillery officer, Mondragon had taken part in trials of, you guessed it, new artillery. Specifically in this case, the Debang system, as produced in France at SAFAMH. And that's how I'm saying that. This is more easily recognized by its nickname, Saint-Chamond. The Debang was an 1870s breech loader that had been modified in the 1880s by Saint-Chamond to fit a hydraulic brake, among other changes. While considering it for Mexican use, Manuel Mondragon developed a number of ideas to simplify the breech mechanism. He also proposed reducing the bore to 70mm, shortening the barrel, in addition to changes in metal selections. This resulted in a cheaper and more mobile, but otherwise modern artillery piece that was within Mexican performance parameters and budget. The project was approved in 1891 with production undertaken in France, which is where Mondragon would apparently make further contacts in the arms industry. Frankly, it seems he took the same interrupted screw experience into the world of small arms. It's worth mentioning that during these developments he rose to the rank of Major in 1889. During 1890 and 91, however, apparently while overseeing production of his artillery, our inventor made friends in the Swiss Industrial Society, a firm still recognized by their acronym SIG. At the time, the firm had been positioning itself along the lines of cutting-edge rifle developments. Most notably, it had participated in the Swiss rifle trials. The resulting Schmidt-Rubin model of 1889 wasn't entirely perfect, but it did a lot to move the needle of innovation, and important to our episode today was a straight-pull bolt-action magazine repeater. This rifle, by the way, was not introduced by SIG. Instead, they actually had a small string of different designs, all straight-pull, that had failed against the Schmidt. One notable entry, however, is this interesting configuration. Using a straight-pull action, it has a ring attached to the cocking piece, double-stacked magazine, and if you pay close attention, a set of 4 locking lugs wrapping around the bolt root. Mondragon likely saw this rifle along with others, and, pulling from artillery experience, had his own ideas on various changes. While I don't have documentation on his very first rifle, we do know it was chambered for the 7.5mm Swiss GP90 cartridge. Testing in Switzerland saw positive results, so the Mexican government agreed to purchase a run of 50 trials models. However, as there wasn't much hope of such a gun replacing the Schmidt-Rubin over in Switzerland, SIG and Mondragon happily tackled the possibility of an improved cartridge over the 7.5. Recall, this is the era of Edard Rubin, a Swiss inventor who frankly defined modern ballistics. His small-bore jacketed bullets and later use of boat-tail geometry would prove revolutionary. The move from roughly 11mm to 8mm begged the questions of 7, 6, and even 5mm. Mondragon worked with Rubin's theories, and together he and SIG cooked up a 6.5 by 53mm cartridge. Moving at about 2,360 feet per second, or 720 meters a second, for the time this was a pretty good clip. The powder was of course smokeless. These trials cartridges were produced by Société Française des Munitions. Thankfully, we did get access to one of the trials rifles. Before we take a look, however, I will point out that as these 50 guns were produced, variations on features were introduced, most notably to the charging handle. Everybody, one insanely rare, basically prototype rifle for the Mexican Army. Let's go ahead and start at the front, where we have a very Swiss-looking assembly, which would make sense considering where it came from. Our nose cap and front band are all one unit. And actually, there may be some modification here. This screw is either severely worn or potentially replaced. I know later examples, especially when we get into the next model, will have an actual stacking rod. This one, it actually does have a blind hole, so it looks like the assembly was intended to be as it is. It's just worn out over the years. But we have our front sight connected directly to that press-on nose cap. It's dovetailed for armor level adjustment. And then we have a cross screw that's actually holding the entire forestock together. We'll just see how that works in a moment here. If I scooter on down, there's no seam, no upper handguard, no lower. One continuous piece of drilled out wood with our forward swivel set underneath with 2 screws. As we keep coming back, we see, yep, that just wraps on around the front of our barreled action, and yet we have a separation here. It's a 2-piece stock. If we keep going back, we'll see she's a straight wrist with a sort of domed buttstock. There's no trap or anything funky to see there for you guys. There's a bit of a tang at the top though. And of course our lower swivel all the way towards the end, infantry style. Our rear sight is graduated from a 400 0 up to 800 meters and is adjustable just like this. It's a standard sort of box quadrant. Those of you who collect Italian rifles or recognize the Swiss influence will see, oh yeah, again, we're coming straight out of Switzerland. Nothing too fancy here. Our action is a linear straight pull bolt action rifle. So if I just pull this guy back, she'll open up. As a matter of fact, this is all the way to the rear. And then if I bring her back forward, you can see we have 2 sets of many locking lugs. We'll see those better in a moment. And then we come on closed. Right about here, we feel that spring pressure from our firing pin catching the sear down in the action. And then as we get here, it gets real tight and you have to overcome what's gonna appear right about here, folks, which is our little camway. Boom, and there she goes. So we've actually turned the bolt in that last little bit into lock. And it is fairly stiff, but from the shoulder, it's not that difficult. So I would rate it better than the Mannlicher 1895, but not quite as smooth as your Swiss straight pulls. This particular bolt is a very early example. The bolt looks fairly plain. That's because it is, at least at this point. Very quickly, they found that if you drop the butt on the ground or handle the rifle sort of abruptly, you can have some inertia just sort of kick this guy open when you don't want it to. So a latch would be added. We're going to see that later on an updated model, but actually even in these pre-production examples, that appeared fairly quickly. So this is a very early example of this gun. What you're seeing here is actually an out-of-battery anti-rotation device. So if I bring this back, we'll have that pin set into the hole that you saw in the bolt body. If I bring it forward, once it goes into battery, it'll actually let go. There's a cam surface here that's doing that. We'll see it better later. But point being is when she's open, you cannot rotate the bolt out of battery unless you intend to. And that's part of taking it apart, is that you can pull this guy back, rotate the bolt, we'll get it out of the gun. That's going to be in a moment as well, because first, let's get a look at this magazine. You can see all the way through, which means we're dealing with a Mannlicher N-block system. I sadly do not have an N-block today, but I will tell you this is a double stack. I have some replicated cartridges here. So it is a double stack. It would be 8 rounds for the rifle example. There was a carbine, that would have been a 6-rounder. I really wish I had a clip to show you today, but you get the idea. You would press the whole thing in, it would lock in, and until you fed out all 8 of your rounds, it would stay in. Once the 8th round was chambered, of course, like any Mannlicher, it would have fallen out the bottom here. And if we want to release the clip early, I can just pull on this guy, it would pop out. Obviously, I still don't have that example, but you guys get the idea. You've seen Mannlichers before. Make no mistake, this was a bolt-action rifle, no auto-loading whatsoever, but there was some hope that a manual repeater could fill a terrible gap in the line. With the emergence of machine guns, and especially their clear advantages when paired with smokeless powder, not to mention a lack of light artillery and other support, the hope was to stretch the rifle as far as they could without having to buy these expensive systems. Instead, a pricier bolt-action magazine rifle combined with a small, light cartridge, which enabled infantry to carry drastically more ammunition, would give them, hopefully, the ability to provide a burst of exceptional fire against, say, advancing cavalry. They actually assessed that cavalry usually charged at about 1,000 meters. This took on average 3 minutes to clear. Those 3 minutes would be very critical to the infantry. So, a rapid rate of aimed fire, even sacrificing some accuracy, would be crucial to breaking the charge. Now, of course, Mexico can't afford to arm everyone with a pricey, complicated straight pull, but if they could squeeze just 1,000 rifles into each infantry brigade, well, that could make up the difference. This rate of fire was of such importance that the Mondragon was fitted with a 3-way safety. What's most interesting about this gun is actually this plate right here. With my bolt forward, in this position, if I pull the trigger, it's going to go bang. In this position, it's not going to do anything. The forward position is where it gets weird. As a matter of fact, it's a little alarming. Watch the birdie, if you will. Yep, that just fired. And if I put it there, it's going to keep on firing every time I work the bolt. Inexperienced shooters were able to take 15 carefully aimed shots per minute in the usual operation, and an easy 60 to 70 when using the rapid slam fire operation. That would, of course, include some reloading. I know you guys want to explore this rifle further, so let's go ahead and take it some of the way apart, or maybe all the way. Let's get this bolt up where we can see what we're doing. If we open up the action some, we have a position in which we can pull on this lever, and that releases the bolt to rotate independent of our camming surface. And that puts us in a position where we can actually bring all of this back and disassemble it from the gun. You gotta keep a little pressure on there, and then we are free. So not the worst way of taking it apart, and I'm being more delicate than you have to be because I'm worried about losing exactly this guy. He's under spring power, and if you don't keep him flexed in, he likes to escape. So not my favorite part of this rifle, but it's still fairly simple to work. Now in theory, our bolt breaks down as such. We have a little pin that's supposed to fit right in that hole for the out of battery lock that we talked about, but this guy likes to go ahead and get lost at any chance he gets. Now if we look down in there, we'll see the front of our firing pin, so that's going to be engaged by this lug when we come back. That's going to retract off of our, it's like our initial little retraction to make sure the firing pin's not touching the back of a case. This guy is unfortunately going to stop us from being able to show you how this works, so let's just go ahead and take it apart a little bit further. We just unscrew the cap. There is no locking system whatsoever for that back cap. It's just threaded. And if we pull out the whole firing pin assembly, we'll see that closer in a moment. Instead, let's focus on just the very basics of rotation, which is this is locked, this is unlocked, locked, unlocked, locked. You get the idea. It's a very short little camming action because we have short little locking lugs. We just have a lot of them. So very little rotation, but we still get a nice full lock, front and rear. As a matter of fact, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Except this guy right here is not really doing any locking, is he? But that's all right. Now, I will point out we are missing our ejector. That would have just been dovetailed in here with a little tail that we'd hit in order for it to pop out. It would strike at a rear point in the receiver. It's lost, but we're going to see a very similar one in a moment, so don't sweat it too much now. On the other side is, of course, our simple overhead extractor. Now that firing pin assembly is pretty neat. The cap just sort of is a cap, and then we have this sort of, it's like a plunger, but it's wrapped around the firing pin, and then obviously it pushes at the rear of the firing pin spring. The front is retained up here. If we look more closely, however, we've got something weird going on here with this hole. That actually indexes with our spring right there. See how it fits? And you've got the same relationship up front, right there. So this guy actually kind of limits the ability of this to turn, but not by much. It just sort of has a recentering effect. It can still flex pretty far for affecting firing pin protrusion. It's a little weird to me how this nut works. I've actually never seen one set up on the front like that. So if we retract our pin, or spring rather, that'll just come right off. And again, we have a hole for alignment. Look at the face of our bolt. You can tell we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lugs, but not all of them appeared to be locking. If I bring this on up, this guy is a little too ground on the other side to actually be providing support. The rest, however, do provide engagement, although this guy not fully. At the rear, we have another set of lugs. If we count along, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all of them are engaging. Now this is our bolt disassembled, although I will say I didn't pry the extractor out of there, and of course we're missing the ejector. And here is a Gewehr 1889 straight pull bolt, which you can tell right away is a whole other scale. Let's pull some of this out of the way and just look at those bolt bodies. Our length is dramatically shorter, although this is uniquely Swiss in sensibility. And our diameter of the bolt body is dramatically reduced. This whole thing is a lot lighter even when assembled. And we don't have this whole supporting structure. And we don't have one giant clean raceway. Although I will say this is a lot smoother given its large scale than this little hole here. But you guys get the idea. This is simpler in many ways, and yet a little more unusual. It especially applies a little bit of love in this department with the charging handle, although it's kind of hard to argue that that is somehow more complex than all of this assembly for the charging handle on the Swiss. Overall, I would say this actually is a fairly refined design in terms of getting it back down to simple. It's just that little things like this guy and this guy are making me a bit nervous. Now, I genuinely love this like unitized entire fore-end construction on this gun, and I really want to show it to you guys in some more detail. So I'm going to take this gun a little bit further apart than usual. We're just going to go ahead and take out this front screw, which is keyed to a set of lugs on the barrel. If we get that out of the way, we'll be able to pull this forward. Now this screw, unfortunately, has lost all of its threading. In theory, you would have to go ahead and unscrew this, but as you can tell, it's not doing a lot here. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull this assembly away while fiddling with it. You know what? Let's do a little cut. With that removed, we have to turn our attention down here to a very interesting screw. Check out the fit on this. It gets even weirder as we actually start to get to work. I'm sorry, guys. I'm not trying to be in your way, but the screw itself is extremely difficult to unscrew because I have to follow it around off axis because they ground a beautiful angle in this guy. Oop, I'm kind of there. To be honest with you, I kind of need a screwdriver that just has a matching counter angle in it in order to do this properly, but I don't have that. I don't really feel like making one just for this gun. I think we got it out without too much trouble. Oh man. With that guy off, we can actually lift away our floor plate. Our follower falls through because it's no longer supported. And then we can pull off the front stock. The barrel is, of course, just a straight taper. Like, this is a pencil if I've ever seen one. However, we really only have a little support at the front and then most of it at the rear, so it's probably doing a fairly good job. But looking at our stock, I dare you to find a gunsmith who would make you this piece of wood today. This is absolutely stunning. One piece, extremely light and yet very strong, and more importantly, specifically designated to handle 150 rounds plus of firing without generating heat that would ever harm the shooter's hand or make it uncomfortable. This is essentially a wooden version of the barrel jacket from the Gewehr 88, and frankly, a better insulator. Turning back to the magazine, there's our floor plate. There's actually nothing to it. We just have some sort of guide tabs to prevent too much lateral walk, and yet nothing else to really key or tab it in. As a matter of fact, it rests on just two shelves at the very front of the action. You might be able to make that out right there. It's fairly slight, and as you saw, it escapes easily when not under pressure from underneath. Which, by the way, is provided by one of the strangest spring assemblies I've seen, short of the very next gun I'm going to show you. Actually, I guess I should be this way. That's the front, keys into that piece of fore-end. And then we have two curved flat springs, which make a beautiful sound, who are just pressing up simultaneously on this guy, and the whole thing's held together correctly by the mag well, so no real retention. This is sublimely simple, actually. I rather like it. Believe it or not, I want to show you guys more stuff in here, although it's a bit fiddly to take apart on camera. If you're curious, I'm going to pop these two screws, which are very delicate at the moment, considering that they're just in a little bit of wood there. This plate's going to come out, and then I'm going to loosen this screw down here. So imagine if you will. For anyone working on these later, by the way, pro tip, set it almost back to safe or even on safe, and then lift her on out. That will undo a beautiful hook there. That is a fun piece of metal work, isn't it? And there's our tab for influencing our trigger and C arrangement. We'll see this better later on in the episode with an animation on a similar gun. Now, at this point, we can just go ahead and pop her open because I've removed a screw here and a screw there at the tang. And this is really just what you'd expect. If we pull her out, there is a swan neck that is sticking out and through and holding our clip down on a spring. Nothing remarkable there. And if we look at our trigger, it's actually fairly simple. We've got a straight link on a spring there until you flip it over and you realize it's double sprung, and only on the one side does it impact the trigger. This one's going straight to a second sear. You can barely make it out, but we've got two sears, one of which is powered by the trigger over on the right side of the gun. The other one is always up unless the bolt is coming back. When the bolt comes back, our firing pin's lug will actually press down and clear it to get out of the gun. When it comes back forward, this always stops, always, under all conditions, stops our firing pin at the rear of the receiver while the bolt is traveling forward still out of battery. The moment the bolt rotates into battery, or actually, I guess I should say rotates, the firing pin's lug will line up with the right side sear, at which point we can either pull the trigger, or if the gun was set for rapide mode, it would already be held back, and it would just go ahead and loose itself and fire for rapide. Now that's as far as we made it for the 1893. However, our example was again very early. A number of improvements were quickly added, but we're going to see the culmination of those in a moment. Further trials in Mexico proved promising. The initial test rifle handled up to 600 rounds fine, and perhaps more were possible, but of course, trials ammo was limited. Rust, dust, and the usual harsh use testing proved to be positive as well, at least as far as we can tell from the scant notes. Comparisons were made with rifles that were from previous trials on hand from testing in 1890, the Gewehr 1888, Daudato, and Mannlicher straight pull. Overall, the Mondragon held its own, though I'm unsure of specific notes between the models. It's also worth noting a carbine version was trialed using a 6-round magazine. It was geared to be as light as possible. One fault noted in testing was that the muzzle velocity of the cartridge had fallen from 720 meters a second, found in Switzerland, to just 691 in Mexico, though this doesn't seem to affect the trials very much. The 50 test rifles finally arrived for real trials in September of 1894, allowing them to be issued to new recruits of the 25th Infantry Battalion. These revealed no severe faults, or at least none are recorded where we have found them. The same month, by the way, saw the rifle on exhibition. President Diaz attended, along with an attaché for Spain, who also took interest. Despite the successes with his new rifle, Mondragon of course found room for improvement, and one of the more dramatic changes came to the cartridge itself, the bullet of which was dropped to just a mere 5.2 millimeters in diameter. This 68mm long case was loaded up with smokeless powder. A sort of piston system was designed with a skirt gasket thingy near the base of the bullet, which was used to help center the bullet in the short-necked case. I also believe the air chamber may have helped keep the chamber pressure overall down, a necessary consideration, as this bullet moved at a screaming hot 830 meters per second. That's 2,723 feet per second. Even with the strange gasket, chamber pressure was still an impressive 2,900 atmospheres. No wonder this gun has two sets of locking lugs. The cartridge was likely created wholly by Edard Rubin in an attempt to min-max performance from the available smokeless powders. And that performance was fairly impressive, especially when focused on the point-blank distance. This is, of course, the range in which a shooter aiming at a standing man will make a potentially lethal hit for the given zero of the sights. The flatter your bullet trajectory, the longer your point-blank distance. For the 5mm Mondragon cartridge, this was decided to be 650 meters, the longest danger zone of any Marshall cartridge at that time, though of course it was still in trials. At 300 meters, it was still capable of penetrating 85 centimeters of spruce block. That's about 33 inches. In time, its radical design would prove unnecessary, but for a brief moment, it was cutting edge. That little ring, unfortunately, would prove to be unnecessary, plus it occasionally got lodged in the bore and made reloading used cases all but impossible. And as for the improved rifle, 200 were produced and delivered, becoming what we tend to call the model of 1894. And thankfully, in this instance, we've had the opportunity to handle one of those in person. Alright, let's take a quick look. Yep, it's pretty similar, and yet there's some distinct changes from our previous model. Let's start up at the front. We still have a unitized nose cap assembly with our front sight, which has been shrunk down and rounded off. And we have our cross screw that holds the whole thing together with the stock, and again is keeping the front portion of the stock on. We also now have a stacking rod for piling these up in your rifle teepee. If we come down, we still have that one-piece stock with our swivel up front, and God, it's just so cool. We get to the rear, we have a quadrant sight, so if we look at that, we have an improved quadrant style. This is very reminiscent of the Swiss 1893 Mannlicher carbine. In this case, we can graduate on up to 2,000 meters as marked on the quadrant. That would be, well, you know what? I can't press that button without first flipping up this plate because we read off of this line here. If I bring her on up, yep, that's our high mark. And if I bring her on down, we can actually do that rapid drop thing. If I bring her on down, I'll point out this guy is zeroed for 400. And yet the reason we can fold it forward is because of that little guy you saw in the back there. There is a little battle sight hiding right in here. We believe it to be zeroed for about 200 meters, but we're not entirely sure. 400 is a little obvious right there off the plate. So in other words, you're supposed to read this sight with everything flat and flush in a hurry at short range, and then normal aiming would be with this plate up, which frees you to be able to access the spring release to go ahead and adjust everything. Skipping the action for a minute, our buttstock is the same as ever, still fairly domed, nice curvature, tang up top, rear swivel at the bottom. They decided to change none of this, straight wrist stock. And then our selector has actually been updated in the sense that it has much stronger reinforced screws on either side that are bedded better. To be frank, the wood was stripped out on the previous one. I had to be very careful with them. This is a good upgrade. As a matter of fact, this configuration was found fairly quickly on even earlier trials guns, so good move. Our markings are also much larger. The firing modes are still exactly in the same position. This is safe, this is fire, and if I roll this forward, it's going to drop the firing pin for our rapid fire. Our action is largely unchanged. Yes, our bolt handle has become a Swiss beer keg style, but that's about it at the front. We still have that same camming groove. We have the same lock pin position for our anti-out-of-battery rotation. We have our extractor overhead. We'll see a sliding ejector in there that actually is present in this gun for reasons we'll cover in a second. And then, of course, this is our disconnect for getting it out of the gun. It does have a detent position where it is now, which is a little nicer, but we'll explain why that works in a moment. If I get the action back, still straight pull, you'll see, yep, we have two sets of locking lugs. And then we actually have this other set here, which do rotate with the bolt, but do not seem to serve as a locking surface, at least not against firing. They are attached to the cocking shroud and seem to be part of the safety's bolt lockup function. We'll see more of that in a moment. Now the magazine has a number of updates. You can tell from the outside we've lost the taper. This screw's a lot more approachable. And we pull this apart, it's going to have some differences. But before we get there, look at this cartridge. The 5.2 millimeter moving at over 2,700 feet per second with a weird ring inside to act as a piston and stabilizer. This is one of my favorite things I've ever encountered, and I have no idea how this gun still has rifling if this is what they were test firing out of it. I don't understand, but I really wish it had happened. Edard Rubin, you madman. This is fantastic. But what's more fantastic than that, this is an end block clip of them, which is already impressive, but we actually have more to go because if you look at the back, there's actually 2 points at the rear, and that matters because if I insert these guys, they work just as you'd expect, at least at first, right there. And if I were to bolt forward, we'd drive that into the chamber. But also, if I over-insert, well, there's a second click, and at this point, I can move freely. Now, I don't want to use live ammo, so here's a dummy, and if you look, that's an easy single shot, feeds perfectly, extracts well, and then we're still down there. So if you want to use your magazine again, we found out that you just go in and then hit your release underneath. Actually, this guy that would normally send our end block clip out of the gun, but since the bolt's closed, it has nowhere to go. And wouldn't you know, we are in the perfect position to go ahead and align as a magazine feeder. So I do believe, I don't have proof, but I do believe this was an intentional magazine cutoff system. Again, if you just want to pop or loose, we can send that on out. Actually, in reviewing and checking this episode, I did find a direct mention of this exact functionality, so it appears that we were correct in our observations. Remember, folks, there are no unintentional cuts in one of these old firearms. Now, of course, just like any Mannlicher, once the last of these cartridges is fed into the chamber, there's nothing holding it up, and therefore it wants to fall free of the action. There is, of course, a hole for that, is right here, and you can see how that would fit right on through with no problem. This is fantastic, but of course, I know you guys want to see what's inside, so use a little fast forward magic. And we'll lift this away to reveal my favorite follower spring system I have ever seen in my life. They doubled the previous version with a plate in between to really get that pressure up to make sure it could follow along as fast as you could ruck-zuck your way through this thing. And then they also interlaced them. So you've got like a shoe and a T on either side. Actually, the spring stack's a little heavier on that one side towards the rear to get the rear of the cartridge up to be picked up, maybe? I'm not entirely sure, but this is easily one of the strangest things I've wandered into without expecting it because I had no information going into pulling this gun apart. I love this. Disassembly is unchanged. We just get this to a sort of mid position, pull this back and rotate and release, and then we bring it back. And I say unchanged, but there is a slight difference, which we'll see if we get this apart. So let me move some things aside. There's now a detent position here in addition to our locking position. So if this little guy, which is now much more rounded, falls onto that spot right there, that is our disassembly / reassembly point. This is critically useful for putting the gun back together. On the previous model, you had to take this lug, ride it all the way forward, press the thing into the gun, and kind of hold it all together while lining everything up in order to push it in. On this one, you just sort of rest your pin there, rest that pin there. When you push, you have 2 points of contact. See how it doesn't want to slide back and forth? That means you can shove it in the gun without this accidentally separating it from itself. It's a bit much to show you myself, but you guys get the idea. If this were able to just sort of wiggle waggle up and down the whole time you're trying to put it together, it definitely is a nightmare. Sure, you have done it 3 times now. At the rear, we've actually presaged the later Nambu Type 38 because we can push this in, turn, and just pop her on out. It's got a little bit of a tight squeeze, but she pops free. That's our back piece. You can see the lug down in there, which was riding in this little J-turn. That's pretty straightforward. Pressure that kept it back was, of course, provided by the firing pin spring, which has this little piece to transfer on, and then this could use a little cleaning, but it works the same way as the other one. Keyed into this guy at the rear, and then at the front, keyed into this little nut, although in this case, it's been squared off. Interestingly enough, inside the bolt has not been squared off, so this doesn't seem to be providing any sort of anti-rotation. It just seems to be a simplification. It may have some interaction with this little guy to prevent rotation at the very end, but it doesn't seem to be fully supported all the way through. It's a bit of a mystery to me why it was flushed off like that. The internal geometries just don't support it. Now, looking at our bolt, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 locking lugs at the rear, same as before. At the front, lock, 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 not a lock. This is just to go ahead and get a cleat on our next cartridge in the line. Now, right here we have our ejector, which was missing on the previous gun, and you can tell the reason why this one is not missing is because of that screw right there, which was added at this point. Rotate that about 180 degrees, and this thing will pop right off to the rear for servicing or replacement. It's a little bit stressful to think that the ejector is operated by a lug that's set in the receiver that's very hard to see, hitting right here on that tiny little bit there. It may also explain why our previous one went missing, but there's your ejector. Just to see it from the front, there's our ejector, back and forth. Our extractor is overhead. And of course, our lugs have changed shape somewhat from the previous model, likely optimizing for strength and also for getting good camming surfaces for primary extraction. We can actually probably bring up a video of the other one to compare. And yeah, there's just a bit of a change there. I said sear earlier, but I should have said safety sear. That notch actually meets up with this guy. When we go to safe, he pops up and prevents rotation of the cocking shroud, which means it stays in lock with its own little lugs, and therefore the bolt cannot be opened on safe. Now I've gone ahead and removed screw and screw so that we can get this guy back. I'll actually depress our clip release, and that'll pull out our trigger guard. This guy's clearly been refined in shape, but same general function. Spring push forward, we push back, and of course it's designed to cleat on the back of our clip here, so that keeps her in position until we pull the button and off she goes. Now let me get this set aside, and we'll drop the stock by teetering this way. Come on out. And then we have a whole other assembly in here because part of rotating this piece here, which we're going to see better with Bruno's help, you can see that camming down in there. Part of rotating this is going to move our safety sear up, which we saw a second ago. I should also point out while you're looking down in here, the cross pin for this on the previous model seems to have been supported on only the one side. It now has a little notch on the other side of the wood to help give it support across both sides. It's a lot stronger. If we look at our trigger assembly though, we still have two springs, one to the trigger, one to that always on sear. And then of course our trigger is the same general pull and setup. We just have this safety wrapped around to lock that system up whenever we turn on the safety to keep the bolt inside the rifle. Another pro tip, if you encounter one of the later patterns that has that safety block, instead of going all the way back to the disassembly position, your key position to get it back together is to go here and then drop her in, and you can pop her back around. Now there was also a carbine form of this rifle. At the back, there's really no differences other than minor production differences between the two guns. We do have a miniature version of our rifle sight. We still have that 400 flip up, and of course it locks out the button. And then at the front, we have our cap and no fitting for a bayonet lug. So this is just a cavalry carbine style of carbine. Not that it has to go to cavalry, just that you're not going to have a bayonet lug. I believe at this time, Mexico did not issue bayonets to artillery as well. One interesting point is that it's still underslung. So if I bring that forward right there, that actually may imply that this was intended for the artillery. Now, I know a lot of this is hard to picture, even with the gun pulled apart in front of you, so I actually had Bruno take some time to make it easier for you to understand.
Don't let this unusual rifle fool you. It's actually quite simple in construction. To load up, we'll open up the bolt and insert our double-stacked in-block clip. Pay attention to our clip latch, which is powered by its own coil spring. As the clip lowers into the magazine, the latch catches in one of two openings at the clip's rear. Fully inserted, the clip is too low to feed ammunition, meaning the magazine is currently held in reserve. In this position, the rifle is a single loader. Toss in a loose cartridge, bolt forward, and fire. To use the magazine, just pull back on the clip latch while the bolt is still closed. Doing this with the bolt open will simply eject our ammunition. By the way, the rounds are being pressed upwards by the follower, which is powered by a set of flat springs squished beneath. The locking lugs for the Mondragon rifle are very unique for their time. Much like a modern Armalite, they are splined around the bolt body. This means we do not have to rotate the bolt a full 90 degrees. Rather, it just needs to turn a little bit to lock or unlock. Because of the high-pressure cartridges, a second set of locking lugs project from the bolt body, making this a rifle that is both front and rear locking. This third set of lugs don't seem to add any strength towards resisting chamber pressure. They project from the cocking shroud. The only mechanical use we can find for them is to keep the bolt from being withdrawn when the safety is engaged. However, that does seem to be a bit overkill. The action is, of course, straight pull in operation. This is our bolt handle, which rides on a track set on the right side of the receiver. Fixed to the bolt handle is this little camming pin, which rides in a sloped groove in the bolt body, just like the Schmidt rifles, but smaller and with less rotation. A second pin affixed to the bolt handle serves as an out-of-battery anti-rotation lock. The pin is powered by its own coil spring, and currently is disengaged from the bolt body. However, as we unlock the action, the pin springs into a detent in the bolt body. This provides resistance against the bolt body turning when the action is out of lock and all the locking lugs are clear of the receiver. With the bolt back, let's look at the firing pin. Since this is a cock-on-close action, there isn't anything keeping it back, except the camming pin, which in the open position does keep the firing pin retracted just enough to prevent it from protruding from the bolt face during feeding. As we close the bolt, take note of the firing pin's lower lug. It first collides with the left-hand sear, then twists over to one on the right. The left sear is a simple spring and lug. It always wants to be upright, and only exists to keep the firing pin cocked until the bolt is locked. At this point, the right-hand sear retains the firing pin as we see it now. This sear is also a flat spring, constantly pressing upwards into the receiver. Its rear extension, however, is lipped over by the trigger. Simply pull, and the sear is pulled down, firing the rifle. Note that the firing pin must travel over the left sear when we open the action, which is why the left side sear must be sprung. This is our fire selector, which, in its current position, is set for repeating fire like a normal bolt-action rifle. Attached to the selector is a rather complicated-looking tumbler, though only this hook shape matters to us now. Turning the selector back rotates the hook over a stud on the trigger, preventing it from being pulled. At the same time, the finger of the hook presses on a rotating block. The block is powered by its own coil spring, so it prefers to be out of the path of the bolt. When the safety is on, however, it rises into a groove in the cocking shroud. This prevents the shroud from rotating, and therefore the bolt is held locked shut. To use the forward position of the selector properly, we'll just have to empty our chamber, or just discharge the current round. Before we turn the lever the other way, take note of that tumbler's unique shape again. Now we're concerned with this lower lobe. If we rotate the other way, it depresses the trigger for us. Hence why you don't want to do this with a live chamber. Now if we bolt back to clear our last casing, as we shove forward, the firing pin will catch on the left sear until the gun locks, at which point, blammo. We've shown it late in sequence, but if we had started in this setting from the beginning, we could have fired the entire magazine very quickly this way. Returning to the magazine, take note that our clip is served as our feed lips. Once the last round clears, however, the clip falls free of the magazine. The extractor is fairly plain, a simple overhand blade which draws our spent casing from the chamber. The ejector is fitted to the bolt body and slides back and forth freely until its tail is struck by the receiver, at which point it kicks the casing from the bolt face. Alright, that's got us covered. Take it back, Othais.
Now sadly, we had no opportunity to demonstrate live fire with that rifle. The cartridge is frankly too difficult to reproduce correctly, and even if we could, it does have the possibility of becoming its own bore obstruction on one of the highest pressure rifles of that era. This is also an extremely rare prototype, so we're not doing that. Even before the total of the trials guns arrived, a National Patriotic Association was formed to help raise funds to aid the government in purchasing the advanced design. I'm unsure of how much they raised, nor where the funds ultimately went. Trialing of those initial rifles was carried out in 1894 and 1895, though the bulk of the order was not ready. Mexico made sure to show it off with the Spanish and the Germans, who again were surprised by the very long-range flat-shooting cartridge and excellent penetration. In April of 1896, the 200 trials rifles and 60,000 rounds of ammunition finally arrived in Mexico proper. Field trials must have been carried out from there, however, I lack any details. We do know that testing was done on live horses and human cadavers at distances up to 1,000 meters with frankly gruesome, but effective results. Penetration was especially noted as good. In August of 1896, an uprising under revolutionary Laro Aguirre resulted in several days fighting in Sonora. Supposedly limited numbers of Mondragon rifles were on hand, but there seems to be no record of their performance. That rumored inclusion was unfortunately, for our show today, the only possible instance of service for the Mondragon repeating rifle. Rewinding a little bit into May of 1896, the Mondragon and its 5mm cartridge were adopted by the Mexican army. There was some lingering doubt as to exactly what bayonet to issue, but the gun seemed to be good to go. Unfortunately, this never seems to have come to fruition. Perhaps this was because of how expensive it was, or maybe because of additional changes that needed to be made to the gun. Fun fact, actually, a copy of the French Artillery Review from October of 1901 contains an article on the same 5mm Mondragon project, apparently still ongoing. An example of what we can only call the final version of the bolt action had been produced by Saint-Étienne. Looking at the loose sketching and reading the text, we find that the firing pin was indeed improved from what we saw earlier on the table. It no longer suffers from a potential shifting protrusion length. The locking lugs are now 6 in number, which would be consistent with later gas-powered changes. And finally, this version of the rifle definitely sports a locking lever on the bolt handle, a feature not seen on our examples, but one that had been witnessed on a subset of Trials Mondragons before. This was basically meant to keep the gun from going out of battery during drill. These ongoing improvements likely mean the Mondragon had been stalled out on development for some time, and even without that problem, it was likely too dang expensive to produce anyway. And all while this was going on, Mexico still did not have a modern rifle. Mexican Secretary of War, General Bernardo Reyes, was forced to make a decision to keep the country moving forward. In 1897, he decided to adopt the then standard Mauser bolt-action rifle as an interim solution. This was chambered for the 7x57mm Mauser smokeless cartridge, already popular in many former Spanish colonies. This adoption, as we'll see, effectively doomed any attempts by Mondragon and Rhyn to introduce a truly improved, super small bore cartridge later on. Mexico's 1893 would be adopted as the Model 1895, which was contracted for in 1897, after delivery and some time to tinker with the Mondragon trials rifles. Even though it was cheaper than their homegrown solution, the Mauser still wasn't inexpensive enough to rearm the whole country. A conversion program was begun on the existing rolling blocks, and some 14,000 new small-bore Remington Model 1897s were brought in as well, further serving as a stopgap. Ultimately, the Mondragon was just too expensive, worth perhaps 2 or more common Mausers, and of course it had to be produced abroad, as Mexico's industrial base had not even caught up to a normal smokeless repeater. Given the limitations in the country, while everyone was proud of and fascinated by the Mondragon repeater, it just wasn't a sound decision. But that doesn't mean he was done. As we'll see next time, Mondragon would see his vision manufactured. And it even, in small numbers, finally saw conflict. Now, I do apologize for the lack of a shooting segment in this episode, and of course Mae won't be able to give an opinion on a rifle that she did not shoot. We did make an attempt to run this dry with snap caps to at least show you how it would work, but unfortunately, as you can see, those failed considerably. Maybe another day. I did, however, want to break this episode out in its entirety because I think the 1894 represents a very curious turning point in firearms history. There was so much effort on that 5.2mm cartridge, and it was so radically different from everything available at the time. I think this warranted a glimpse at where technology could have gone if it just hadn't, if the boat tail hadn't been introduced, if Spitzer hadn't really evolved. This was them trying to get something out of the ragged edge of the technology that they understood. And also the gun itself is a straight pull, double stack, end block clip rifle. That is absolutely fascinating. And so, I'd just like to point out that Mexico was basically 1 or 2 steps away from having the strangest of the repeating rifles that never saw adoption. Anyway, I'd like to give special thanks to the 2 people that helped out the most on this episode. Luis Gonzalez was a huge help. He actually is the writer of the current Mondragon book, and he is still doing active research, so please give a look to that and help support him in those endeavors. And of course, our esteemed collector and host for this entire experiment, Victor, we really appreciate it. You have given the entire world a glimpse into the development of the Mexican rifle. If you guys appreciate them loaning their time and their energy to the show, by all means, thank them down in the comments. All right, we appreciate you all being here, and of course, we'll have something very special in our next episode. Have a good one. It's Colt's letters that he kept. So Colt wouldn't have kept anything that made him look bad.
Yeah.
So then you have to go around and find ordnance documents and things where he interacted with other people that might still exist. So you have to be careful. Anybody that tries to biography Colt ends up falling under Colt's spell because they read Colt's material, you know?
Weird question. Has anyone done one on Edward Rubin or Charles Ross?
Jonathan has always been a consummate helper of research and discovery in the firearms world at his own expense of time and effort and without any sign of recompense. Like, Jonathan has always, in my interactions with him, been both friendly and professional and determined to get to the root of what is going on.
Oh, yeah.
He gets an alert of motion in the cabin, which that thing's never alerted you, other than, you know, when one of us goes out there.
To be fair, the alert should cascade from alert from the outside of the property that someone has arrived, and then alert to the inside. But this time, I just got an inside alert. Yeah.
You pulled out your phone, and I saw your face like, what just happened?
Right.
It's a wonderful little video of what appears to be, because it's in night vision mode or whatever, so it's shining an infrared light out.
Uh-huh.
And something just out of nowhere appears in front of the camera like a specter. A Berthier Model 16 clip, because this was developed at the same time And by a different group, they are similar because they provide a similar function, but they are convergent designs. They do not work in each other's systems. You can see at the back here, there's these little notches that allow these to be able to be held down.